So without further ado, please welcome Marianne Williamson.
Thank you. Can I go a little bit lower down here? Thank you. I agree with Magda that flexibility is part of the process of such an event as this. And so if you've got 1,000 people marching who will be here, then obviously I will be more than glad to give up the microphone to whoever is speaking for that group. In the meantime, by being here, like you're being here, I am here because I am both interested and compelled by the general tenor of what this movement represents. As I was saying when I was here last week, we all know that the success of this movement is not guaranteed, but at the same time there's something going on here that is undeniable, and for us to take care of it as best we can, to foster it, to drive it from our wisdom and our intelligence, our conviction and our nonviolence is absolutely essential. So I'm grateful. There are so many wonderful conversations going on here. There are people talking about constitutional law. There are people talking about economics. There are people talking about Mahatma Gandhi and the principles of nonviolence. And I know for myself and for many of us, that is what both enrolls me in this movement and also makes me feel very positive about its possibilities. That there does seem to be a real critical mass of people who understand that it is more than our outrage, in many ways very, very justifiable, about certain economic and social policies in the United States. But we know that we need to bring more than just our emotion, more than just our passion. We need to bring our emotional and psychological and intellectual clarity and self-discipline. So I'm real grateful to have this opportunity, and I thought that if I might tonight, I would just share a little bit about some aspects of our history into which this movement connects. The idea that in many ways this movement is and will be too easily dismissed by those who do not recognize the deep intellectual and historical roots that precede this movement. And you know, everything that happens in our lives, particularly every change that happens, derives from a conversation. It's a conversation going on in our heads, and it's a conversation going on in our communities. And so a large part of the beauty of this gathering is that people are having conversations. So I'd like to have a little bit of a conversation with you tonight about what the United States of America represented, not only as a historical unfoldment, but as a spiritual unfoldment in terms of the possibilities of humanity, and how I see what all of us agree on is the way over emphasis of corporate power and its over-influence in our social, economic, and political policies, what this means in historical terms, and why it is so right that our generation of Americans seeks to repudiate it now. When we were children, we were taught about the ancient regime of Europe, when kings and aristocrats ruled everything. We were taught when we were children about the divine right of kings, and how the king had some friends, and the friends had all the money, and the friends had all the property, and they were called the aristocracy, and everybody else basically served them. They were given just enough to make sure they had the energy to keep working for the aristocrats. And then when the king and the monarchy and the aristocrats had everything they wanted, everything they needed, everybody else who'd basically been turned into serfs got what was left. Well, the founding of this country was theoretically a complete repudiation of that. It was rather the idea that it would not be an aristocracy, it would not be a monarch, but that it would be the wisdom and the intelligence of the average citizen, no matter where we came from, no matter who our parents were, no matter how much money we had, no matter what our education. It's very radical. Even if you look at the Constitution that the president, him or herself, it just said born here and 35. Nothing about a certain amount of education necessary, certain kind of parentage, anything like that. Now, we all know that there is great irony to the fact that the people who wrote and the people who signed the Declaration of Independence were themselves slave owners. we understand that we do not look at the founders and acknowledge them for the fact that they themselves embodied the principles they bequeathed to us. No, we don't, because they themselves, this irony was not lost on them. They meant white men, clearly. So from the beginning, the United States, we were founded on these amazing radical principles that it is the average human being, no matter who we are, no matter where we come from, that the country belonged to all of us. And that each of us, the reason there would be universal education was so that we would have, Jefferson felt that without education we would not have the critical thought processes necessary to be entrusted with the governance of a nation. They wanted a free press so that theoretically we would know what was going on, we would have the information. And then it was deemed that the intelligence of the average American and the wisdom of the average American, into these hands would be posited the governing force of the country. From the beginning, there has been obviously ways in which we did not stand on the principles we purported to believe in. We were founded in many ways on the genocide of the American Indian, understood. We had slavery, understood. Women did not have suffrage, understood. The point, however, is that the political, historical drama of the United States has been that with every generation, there have been forces who sought to expand the meaning of those principles. Like Martin Luther King said, we're not here for new rights, we're here to demand the rights we already have, theoretically. So there have been in every generation those who sought to embody further, as a nation, the principles on which we already purport to stand. And in every generation, there have been those who would seek to withdraw in actuality the resources of the country from the forces on which we purport to stand. Now, what has happened in the last 40 to 50 years in terms of economic and social policy in the United States is that we have, for all intents and purposes, recreated an aristocracy. We have, with our political and social policies, so sucked the vast resources of the public purse into the hands of a very few that for all intents and purposes we have recreated a situation in which a small group has, as it were, a monopoly on the wealth of the nation, leaving it too difficult for the majority citizens in the United States to be said in a practical sense to be working from a level playing field. And the late Justice Louis Brandeis, a Supreme Court justice, said these words: you can have large amounts of wealth concentrated in the hands of a very few, or you can have democracy. You cannot have both. And so what has happened over the centuries since this country was founded is that despite this profound political drama, generation after generation, some seeking to embody more fully, saying, no, we should not have slaves. Yes, blacks should be equal. Yes, women should be equal. Yes, Native Americans should be equal. It's happening now with, yes, gay people should be equal and be able to get married. This is always happening in the history of the United States. But the point that I'd like to place into the listening tonight so that we remember, because I believe that it empowers us and gives us a greater sense of the moral justification of what we are doing here. America has historically tended to self-correct. Yes, we have lived in ways that are against the principles that we ourselves agreed to have fealty to, but throughout our history, we have tended to self-correct. And what this movement represents at its best, and that's why it's not only important, but why it is so morally, politically, philosophically, and historically correct, is that this movement seeks a course correction in the unfoldment of American democracy, American government, American capitalism, and to that I say, hallelujah, it is about time. For me, I think for any of us as individuals, but I think it's also true of a nation. You know, it's so interesting because just as we learn how individuals go through phases of growth, well, so does a nation. You go through developmental stages in a system just like you do in an individual's life, because all that a nation is a collection of individuals. And so this is a phase. It's also important that we realize that these mistakes, these problems that you and I deal with, they have not been there forever. This orgiastic trend towards deregulation, the way the government now, you know, one of the first principles of American democracy was the idea that the government would be the balance. The government would balance individual liberty, which includes economic liberty, that the government would balance that with a concern for the public good, which means that corporations would be allowed to do what they wanted to do. However, if their behavior put too many carcinogens in the air, in the food supply, desecrated the planet, whatever it was, that then meant that they were overreaching into a place where the common good was at risk, the government would be there to advocate for the people. And that's what appropriate regulations on corporate power are about. And that's why if you look at something even like the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency was founded by Richard Nixon, a Republican. Ronald Reagan himself, you can look on YouTube and see where Ronald Reagan himself said millionaires should pay their share. What happened in the year 1980, and has continued only slightly abated, is this idea that deregulating corporations, letting them do whatever they wanted to do, was somehow the way to make all the ships rise. That's trickle-down economics. And what it has done, as we know, is that it has created the greatest level of economic disparity in the United States since 1929. They began cutting taxes at the top and cutting benefits at the bottom. Now, once again, the history, the beauty of knowing history. In his farewell address, George Washington warned us about political parties. There's nothing in the Constitution that says we will have two major political parties. There's nothing in the Declaration of Independence that says we will have two major political parties. And the history of social justice movements in the United States is that abolition came from the Abolitionist Party. Women's suffrage came from the Women's Suffrage Party. Social Security came from the Socialist Party. It's been only since the 1960s that two major political parties have put a wrap on the situation the way they have. And George Washington warned us about this. Now, this is a real problem when you have what we have today. You have one major political party who is basically just the ideological arm of the corporatocracy. And these people really believe that if the richest among us have their way, I mean, I think some of them are really very sincere. They honestly believe they know better what's best for us. And then America is better. And unfortunately, we have another major political party. As I was saying last time I was here, they seem to understand that it's wrong. They seem to understand that huge amounts of human suffering are caused by this terrible imbalance. They understand that jobs are lost, and educational opportunities are lost, and economic opportunities are lost, and health is lost. They seem to understand that. But even that second major political party will not, at least at this point, challenge the underlying forces that make all that suffering inevitable. And when President Clinton said the other day that he believes that what this Occupy Wall Street movement should stand for is President Obama's jobs bill. With all due respect, that's too little, too late. It is time for the people of the United States to say the power is meant to be in the hands of the people of the United States, not just in the hands of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. We don't have a king, we don't have an aristocracy, and this conversation is the one that is standing up for the historical tide and the historical thread of which we should all be proud. Woo! I say these things and put this into our listening because I think with any situation, whether we are talking about individuals or we're talking about a collection of people, you can only go as wide as you are deep. And so there will be, there are certain stages of change. When anytime there's a major social justice movement, the social justice movement is supported by those who are considered outrageous radicals by the status quo of their time. 'Twas always thus. Then what happens, of course, is that those outrageous radicals will be minimized and teased and made fun of and mocked. 'Twas always thus. Then if they start to actually have an effect, which seems to be happening, and if the effect continues to grow, that group will actually be treated with some hostility if necessary. What we want to remember, however, is if we stand firm, if we remain nonviolent, if we remember, as Martin Luther King said, he said the desegregation of the American South, that was the political goal of the civil rights movement, but the deeper goal was the establishment of the beloved community. If we seek the beloved community here, if we remember that every corporate CEO also must be part of this, the beloved community. King said, God said, I have to love my enemy, he didn't say I have to like them. This has to do with a refusal to demonize personally anybody, even those with whom we disagree. If we stand firm, then we will be the conduits, we will be the channels for the unfoldment of a chapter, a great glorious chapter of self-correction in American democracy. And what will happen here is what happens in all social justice movements. It begins as just a group of ragamuffin people who are considered outrageous radicals by the status quo of their time, who end up making something happen in this country which will seem to later generations who have been self-evident. Of course it was necessary, and God bless those people who did it. Thank you very much.